Thank you for coming this evening to the latest installment of The Conversation at the UC Davis Humanities Institute. My name is Jamie Fisher, and I'm a professor in the departments of German and Cinema and Digital Media, and the faculty director of the DHI, as we call it. The DHI is a leading voice on our campus for the essential value of the arts and humanities. Part of our mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can and we think should contribute to debates and controversies in our broader society. This can and should be even more true, I think, in these trying times. And our topic tonight takes these challenges head on and is entitled COVID-19, the Disappearing International, Challenges and Opportunities for Global Human Rights. We will have 3 speakers and then, we hope, a free-flowing discussion on the topics that their presentations raise. So just a few words about the format. I will briefly introduce each of the speakers, and then our moderator, Professor Keith Wattenpaugh, will moderate the short presentations offered by each speaker, as well as the Q&A afterward. I will step back and actually not appear again because I'll be operating the technology behind our YouTube channel. In terms of your own participation in the audience, you're welcome to enter any question you'd like into the chat window of YouTube, where questions for the panelists will then be screened by Kathy Wallerstein of the DHI and Professor Michael Lazzara. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the UC Davis Human Rights Studies Program, UC Davis Global Affairs, International House Davis, the UC Davis Office of Public Scholarship and Engagement, and the UC Davis School of Law. A quick special thank you to Kathy Wallerstein and Professor Michael Lazzara for fielding questions, and to our esteemed presenters, and to the DHI staff who helped set this all up. So we have 3 distinguished speakers this evening. Professor Karima Ben-Noon has worked in the field of human rights for more than 25 years in a variety of capacities and in most regions of the world. She is a former Amnesty International legal advisor and current member of the Board of Editors of the American Journal of International Law. She's been an expert for the International Criminal Court, and she's published widely, both in academic journals like the European Journal of International Law and mainstream media outlets like the New York Times and Reuters. Her book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, about people of Muslim heritage working against extremism, published by W.W. Norton, won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. The TED Talk based on this book has been viewed nearly 1.5 million times. She's currently the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, as well as the Homer Angelo and Ann Berryhill Endowed Chair in International Law at the UC Davis School of Law. At our event tonight, she'll be speaking in her own personal capacity. Our second panelist is Professor Joanna Rogulska, who's Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, as well as Vice Provost and Associate Chancellor at Global Affairs at the University of California, Davis. Her scholarly and policy work has focused on decentralization, democracy, women's political participation, women's agency, and political identity, as well as on changing gender roles under conditions of regime transformations. She is the author and co-author of 7 books and the author of over 100 articles, chapters, and reviews. Her scholarly work has been supported by a wide range of private and public funding agencies. Professor Rogulska's earned her master's degree from the University of Warsaw, Poland, and PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. She received a Doctor Honoris Causa from the Tbilisi State University in Georgia in 2011. Keith David Wattenpaugh is professor and founding director of the UC Davis Human Rights Studies program. He is a leading expert on the history and theory of human rights and humanitarianism, and is author most recently of the multiple award-winning Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, UC Press 2015. He's received major awards from the Ford, Carnegie, and Open Society Foundations on behalf of his work to help refugee university students. He's been a senior fellow in international peace at the U.S. Institute for Peace, an American Council of Learned Societies International and Area Studies Fellow, and this year was in the inaugural group of the Institute of International Education's Centennial Fellows. On the lighter side, he has one. He is finishing a book entitled Most Human, Storytelling, Human Rights, and Star Trek. And so I hand the metaphorical mic over to Professor Wattenpaugh.
All right. Thank you, Professor Fisher. I just want to note as we start that for almost 10 years now, UC Davis Human Rights Studies has worked with the Davis Humanities Institute on a whole range of issues and activities, from the yearly Human Rights Watch Film Festival and the Davis Human Rights Lectures to faculty and graduate seminars, and a new project that we're collaborating on to help bring cutting-edge human rights and genocide studies research to California's high school teachers, and by way of them, our state's next generation. This decades-long relationship speaks to a unique element of the study of human rights at UC Davis. The Human Rights Studies program is located within the College of Letters and Sciences with a large undergraduate and graduate program reaching nearly 1,000 students a year with courses that embrace the diversity of the way human beings experience human rights. That includes everything from the study of genocide and human rights and gender and the history of human rights to the intersection of human rights with popular culture, memory, and the arts. For nearly 10 years as well, UC Davis Human Rights Studies has collaborated with one of the other sponsors of tonight's program, Davis's International House, something which emphasizes our commitment in the Human Rights Studies program to public engagement and bringing scholarship and research into conversation with our friends and neighbors throughout California. This evening's conversation was conceived in the spirit of those collaborations and something more. The pandemic demands of a modern leading public research institution like UC Davis nothing less than an unqualified and absolute commitment to using our immense capacity for scholarship, research, ingenuity, teaching, and the creation of beauty for the common good. Human rights studies and what we do in the humanities, arts, and social sciences has a critical role to play in serving that common good at this time of generational challenge. Perhaps the most important role is reminding us all of our shared humanity and our shared responsibilities to one another as we work to uphold the rights and dignity of all. Part of that commitment must be making certain our discoveries and data be made available to all, including vaccines and therapies. As the effects of the last months take hold over the next years, that task of seeing the humanity of the other will grow increasingly difficult. Indian novelist and activist Arundhati Roy has asked us to imagine the COVID-19 pandemic as a portal between our current world and a possible better one. For those in the field of human rights studies, the pandemic and the social and economic upheaval it has caused feels instead more like a fast approaching and powerful tide that will accelerate the ongoing erosion of global human rights. With the arrival of that tide, we will see a massive inward turn by states and peoples that will create intense isolationism and ferocious anti-globalization movements not seen since the era of World War I and the Great Depression. As both an idea and a practice, human rights are dependent upon an incredible range of global, interconnected, and robust coalitions and constellations of institutions, movements, and non-governmental organizations, and laws and norms. Collectively, the international. The international is also an attitude that places the value on cooperation and collaboration across national boundaries, and an openness to the other and a celebration of infinite human diversity. The current emergency has laid bare the weakness of critical international institutions and the whole idea of international action and cooperation when it has been most needed. From the multiple failures of the World Health Organization, the silence of the UN Security Council, to the botched response by the European Union, the international has begun to disappear, and with it, the structural and ethical foundation of the human rights idea itself. Compounding that failure, of course, is the United States that has abandoned any pretense of global cooperation on health, the environment, and human rights. Now, that said, in just the last few days, the United Nations has taken a few hesitant steps towards leadership and coordination. In a report issued by the United Nations General Secretary Antonio Guterres just a week ago titled, "We Are All in This Together, Human Rights and COVID-19 Response and Recovery," he begins by reminding us of something that is often forgotten. States have a duty to protect human life, including by addressing the general conditions in society that give rise to direct threats of life. He also notes, and this is a quotation, quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic is a public health emergency. But it is far more. It is an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a human crisis that is fast becoming a human rights crisis. He warns against, for example, the use of the pandemic as a pretext to adopt repressive measures, echoing a statement made earlier last month by 24 UN rapporteurs in human rights and related fields. Quoting them, emergency declarations based on the COVID-19 outbreak should not be used as a basis to target particular groups, minorities, or individuals. It should not function as a cover for repressive action under the guise of protecting health, nor should it be used to silence the work of human rights defenders. Restrictions taken to respond to the virus must be motivated by legitimate health goals and should not be used simply to quash dissent, unquote. Nonetheless, that is happening. Hungary's anti-democratic populist prime minister, Viktor Orban, has used the pretext of the pandemic to pass legislation, entrusting him with near limitless power. In Uganda, authorities imposed strict rules against assembly to target LGBTI activists. Cambodia's new emergency laws, which do very little to address the emergency and much more to rein in dissent, are, in the words of a recent Human Rights Watch report, quote, a recipe for dictatorship. The list grows longer every day. Once established, states of emergency orders prove especially tenacious and are very difficult to lift. In the faces of these basic norms of human rights practice are elements of the international prepared to take steps to reaffirm those very democratic norms in the period after the emergency passes. In no way are these cautionary statements about state violations of human rights an endorsement of the ugly manifestation of how the human rights idea can be abused, like we saw just earlier today as armed demonstrators took over parts of the Michigan Capitol to protest against death-driven and reasonable public health social distancing measures. I have another fear about how the pandemic is used. I think it will be used to eliminate the structure of refugee protection and resettlement that has worked since the end of World War II. The 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which establishes guiding principles for the treatment of people fleeing violence and persecution, is the most endangered element of the international human rights system at the moment. Just this last week, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, called attention to the threat to human rights of the use of the emergency to alter inexorably the rules protecting and supporting refugees. Quoting him, that human rights norms, laws, and policies so critical for the protection of refugees in desperate need of safety will be undermined in ways that could take many years to rebuild. Again, like states of emergency, once these norms of civilian protection for refugees have been abandoned, they will be impossible to rebuild. And as economic conditions worsen, anti-refugee and anti-migrant attitudes will harden. Refugees will be scapegoated as both biological vectors of disease and the cause of economic woes. There are many more areas of immediate and longer-term concern raised by the pandemic, but now it's really my pleasure to turn to Professors Benoon and Regulska as the conversations continue. We'll also come back to the question of Roy's portal to think about areas of optimism and collective action, especially to support economic, social, and cultural rights. Let me now turn to Professor Benoon for a moment. Right. So Professor Benoon, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So what has concerned you most so far about the impact of the pandemic and the global response or non-response on human rights, and in particular on human rights defenders?
Thanks very much for this question. And before I answer it, let me thank the organizers for inviting me and the UC Davis Humanities Institute for hosting. It's a real privilege to be here with Professor Wattenpaugh and the Vice Chancellor Regulska, who are two sort of leading global thinkers at UC Davis. And I'm really honored to share this evening with all of you who are listening. I am very heartened that in this moment when we have to stay at home locally for health reasons, so many people are still committed to thinking globally. And I think mastering the ability to do those two things simultaneously will be really critical in the coming months. Now to your question regarding my concerns about the human rights impact of the pandemic and of the responses to it. Let me say that the pandemic is perhaps the largest global public health crisis in a century, and it is nothing less than a cataclysm for human rights, which gravely undermines and threatens nearly every single human right guaranteed by international law, starting with the right to life and the right to health. As the UN Secretary General has noted, governments have to take extraordinary measures to preserve human life now. Of the more than 3.1 million people confirmed infected with COVID-19, according to the Johns Hopkins tracker, more than 231,000 have died, 231,000 in every region of the world, from China to Italy, from Iran to Ecuador, from California to New York City, just in the last few months, sometimes dying away from loved ones, sometimes losing their lives unnecessarily when appropriate public health policies and effective global and national leadership could have prevented their deaths. Let us really sit with that thought for one moment, because that number will be even higher by the time we are done with this discussion this evening. These are not statistics, but real people. And I think, for example, of Ronald Lewis, a 68-year-old African-American transit worker and cultural historian in New Orleans, who wrote a book called The House of Dance and Feathers, which is considered the most detailed map of the Big Easy's culture. He fell to the coronavirus in early April. And I am sorry that our national leadership is doing so little to memorialize these victims. I hope there will be an international memory project in the future to commemorate these losses. Let's also start tonight by thinking of the healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, EMTs, hospital workers, of whom we have asked far too much and for whom we have clapped while utterly failing collectively to provide them with the necessary protective equipment and support. And I think tonight particularly of Dr. Lorna Breen, an emergency room doctor who served on these front lines, contracted coronavirus, and tragically committed suicide just a few days ago after the horrors that she witnessed. And it seems to me that our entire discussion tonight takes place in the shadow of these enormous global losses. And we should really be haunted by this question: what will we do globally, nationally, and locally to prevent additional losses? And I think here really of the words of some Middle Eastern documentary filmmakers, Jean Chamoun and Mai Masri, from a film from long ago. And there's a line that really stayed with me, which is, "The dead do not sleep. They are watching us lest we should sleep." And to me, that is really the starting point of this discussion. So beyond the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of your life and to the highest attainable standard of health, nearly every human right across the spectrum of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is threatened by the pandemic and or by the legitimate measures needed to combat it. From the right to freedom of assembly to the right to freedom of movement, from the rights to Social Security to the rights to work and to a livelihood. And on the latter point, it is very striking to note the prediction of the International Labor Organization yesterday that almost half the global workforce, 1.6 billion people, are in immediate danger of having their livelihoods destroyed by the economic impact of COVID-19. The right to food is likewise imperiled. We're seeing this here in the United States with the long lines outside of food banks, and the UN is also warning that the virus could double severe hunger around the world, affecting 265 million people. The cultural rights that I work on with the UN are also gravely impacted, but I'll say more about that later. Now, let me stress that limitations to certain human rights like freedom of assembly and freedom of movement in the face of a pandemic like this to protect public health can be entirely legitimate and necessary. And in fact, these limitations are built into international legal norms guaranteeing human rights. And the UN Human Rights Committee, which oversees one of the UN human rights treaties, has clearly said to states that they may need to take some measures derogating from or limiting some human rights obligations, which allow such limits, but they have to do so in accordance with relevant international law rules, such as necessity, proportionality, and non-discrimination. It is reprehensible when states misuse public health claims as a justification for violating human rights, not respecting these standards set out by the Human Rights Committee. But at the same time, as Professor Wattenpaugh said, we have to entirely reject the misuse of human rights claims to seek to subvert necessary and legitimate public health measures in ways that gravely undermine the rights of others. And I was deeply disturbed to hear on CNN today a barber here in California, very close to Davis, saying he is going to open his business tomorrow, putting others at risk and using rights language to try to justify what he's doing. That is completely illegitimate. Now, what really worries me, and there's much more that I could say, but moving forward rapidly, what really worries me is the totality of the threat to all or most human rights all around the world of everyone, all at the same time. And I think it's that scope and that scale that we have to really focus on. I'm also worried, as Professor Wattenpaugh said, by the lack of leadership in many countries committed to protecting human rights in the face of this sort of total threat. In my view, in response, we need a vigorous, holistic human rights approach that centers universality, that stresses that literally the rights of everyone are being affected or could be affected, and a response that at the same time recognizes diversity. That is to say that some may face disproportionate impacts due to various forms of discrimination and could be affected differently by the pandemic, and that has to be taken into consideration. We also need a human rights approach that practices the idea of interdependence and indivisibility that we've talked about in human rights for decades, meaning we take into consideration the range of rights, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social. We take all of those rights into consideration, while at the same time recognizing the centrality of the right to life, which the UN Human Rights Committee has described as the supreme right, which has crucial importance both for individuals and for society as a whole. I encourage you to go read the general comment by the Human Rights Committee on the right to life. And I really note the connections between all of these rights. I think about the work of Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, who argued that freedom of expression is critical, for example, in preventing famine. Well, the same thing is true here. Freedom of expression and the rights of human rights defenders are critical in confronting the pandemic. And there is a recent study showing that if the Chinese government had listened to its brave Chinese whistleblowing doctors at the beginning of the pandemic, instead of threatening and harassing them, the numbers of cases could have come down significantly. So all of these human rights are connected. We need, faced with COVID-19, a thick human rights analysis that is not reduced simply to a critique of state action, though that is an important part of it. We need to think about respecting, protecting, ensuring, and fulfilling human rights. We need states to be constrained to respect international law, and Professor Wattenpaugh gave the example from Uganda. But also we need states to be empowered to act in a range of ways to protect and ensure human rights, to act in accordance with science and public health, to protect life, to guarantee provision of PPE, to protect the supply chain, and to take necessary steps to combat the pandemic, such as stay-at-home orders. And we've clearly seen the consequences of the failure of strong and clear leadership at the national level in this country in this regard. There are many positive human rights initiatives that have been taken, and I'm running out of time, so I can only mention one or two. Professor Wattenpaugh already mentioned the UN Secretary General's policy paper, We Are All in This Together, that says that human rights should be at the center of the global response because a human rights lens means that no one is left behind and puts everyone in the picture and really focuses on the human rights impact. And he called for effective rights-respecting action to respond to the pandemic. Just today, the coordinating committee of the special procedures, that special rapporteurs like me, independent experts appointed by the UN system, met with the UN Human Rights Council, which is the highest political body in the field of human rights in the UN, to stress that the principles of non-discrimination, participation, empowerment, and accountability are critically important in the way that states and the international community respond to the pandemic. So there's a lot more I'd like to say, but just to respond very quickly, just to sum up, let me say the threat to human rights from the pandemic both its primary and its secondary effects is enormous and should not be understated. But there is hope, and we see that when effective measures are taken, such as here in California, literally tens of thousands of lives can be saved. So we are empowered if we take the correct action in accordance with human rights. There have been some very important human rights responses, but these need to be maintained, mainstreamed, and magnified to protect humanity.
Thank you, Karima. I'm letting this sink in for a second. That was wonderful. And now I want to turn and pose a very similar question to Professor Regulska to sort of take this more in the direction of the local and national, reflecting on some of the research that she's been working on. So again, what's concerned you most so far about the impact of the pandemic and local and national responses you've been studying, especially in the field of protecting reproductive freedom and women's rights in this critical moment?
Thank you. Thank you so much to Davis Humanity Institute and, of course, to Human Rights Program at UC Davis, as well as our international house in Davis, who is part of our community. So let me start with maybe putting even a larger picture in where we are. And that is that in a global context, we actually operating on several scales. We're operating on supranational scale. We're operating at the national scales. We're operating at the regional scale, and we're operating in local scales. And of course, all depends on what are the particular structure of the governance in particular countries, and how they relate to the supranational level by being a member, by not being a member, by being excluded, by being admitted to the membership. And I think this plays tremendous role as we look at the pandemic. And as pandemics has really have shown, institutional responses at each of those levels not only are not in agreement very often, but very often are actually in disagreement. And if we look at the United States, I think that plays out enormously over the last several weeks. Who is really in charge? Who is doing what? Who is began to collaborate with whom and creating coalitions in order to protect people. And that is people who are at that local level. So that web of different scales that intersects with each other is important, because as we move through the pandemic, it became very clear and forcefully painful that there is a fundamental tension between the political interest, public health concerns, and then basic freedoms. And these three elements, as we think about these scales, truly play very differently depending on what these political interests very often are. So the danger, of course, is that the political interests will prevail and a variety of these new restrictions, new orders, new technologies and practices imposed because of what Professor Banon was taking, because of the health crisis, as we adopted these emergency measures, will actually become permanent and will weaken the democratic institutions at all these levels, not just one particular level. And I think this is where it's the importance to remember that just because one level is interacting and acting, that doesn't mean that the supranational level will not be weakened, as we saw when President Trump decided to go after the World Health Organization, right? Or after the UN. And that is this intersection of the scales and the interests that will really weaken democratic institutions, as I pointed out, but also suppress dissent and restrict the whole host of the rights and freedom. As was already mentioned by Professor Wattenpaugh and also by Professor Karima Banon, the international institution began to respond, and actually by mid-March, we saw increasing more forceful statements about the impending dangers of human rights violation. But some statements and some institutions weren't so actually forceful and were rather remaining silent. And it's exactly where the point is of at which level and how much power they have, or how much power they're really willing to exercise in order to be part of the much larger global dialogue. The Human Rights Commissioner for Europe's top human rights body, the Council of Europe, actually said by mid-March, in this extraordinary time of the COVID-19 pandemic, politicians and decision makers must resist temptation to push through measures that are incompatible with human rights. By mid-April, she was far more forceful and has issued a human rights report and argued there that exacerbating long-standing problems, emphasizing the weakness of Europe's human rights protection system. And we know that there are numbers of weaknesses. And the paradox here is that Council of Europe, which is really the primary body around the human rights, has actually very little power to exercise that statute and that commitment that it's have. And I think when we're looking at the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, there was also a warning in mid-March that states and security sector institutions will find emergency powers attractive because they offer shortcuts. And as a result, they tend to persist and become permanent. So the warnings were there, but the often tentative language really did not reinforce itself. I think very recently, as was mentioned with the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres, but even he was talking about human crisis that is fast becoming a human rights crisis, when we already knew that this is a human rights crisis. And I'm pointing out to all these elements because they are political. And the political interest comes through these statements and comes through these papers and reports. The problem is that a lot of times these statements are made, but then the question is who's going to act on these statements and what's going to happen and where the resources going to come from and who will actually engage and be in the position of power to make this statement reality. Because statement in itself, it feels good when we read them, when we quote them. But really, truly, the meaning going to be if we're going to save people's life. The true meaning going to be if we're going to help people to minimize the social inequalities that are emerging. And I don't want to go into the European Union because that's another level of the international institutions. But the European Union has, in fact, very little power to tell the states what to do and what to do, not to do, because it's limited in the shared competency. And that means that it has to negotiate with particular state governments what it can and what cannot do, especially in the area of public health. It's a little bit better in the trade and customs and monetary and areas. So despite these words of warning on the international level, the reality was and is that many governments on every continent have used the excuse of pandemic to engage in authoritarian, discriminatory, oppressive, violent behaviors, impacting a whole range, as was already pointed out, of civic, political, social, economic, cultural rights. And that is, I think, so often misunderstanding that we focus on one parcel rather than thinking in a totality, which was already pointed out. So the government has pushed a variety of new policies, enacted orders, decrees, authorized use of all kinds of technologies to restrict, violate, ignore, and suppress the human rights. And of course, these actions, some, as was pointed out also, are justifiable, but many of them absolutely are not. I'm going to add a few more examples of what Professor Wattenpaugh pointed out, because the truth is that that's where the totality comes. So I'm going to ignore the examples that were mentioned, but let's talk about the campaigns and elections. Campaigns and elections not only took place in Wisconsin, but in my own country, in Poland, that the presidential elections will be on May 10th. What does that mean in practice? That means that actually voters will be disfranchised and that the voters going to have to choose between the right to vote and right to life. And that is phenomenal, important, and crucial that we understand what the work of this state government is really meaning on an individual level, on the local level. My 92-year-old mother in Poland said that she's going to vote. And I said, no, you cannot vote. You cannot leave the house. And she, who has been democratically brought and engaged, I'm going to vote. I always vote since 1989, and I'm going to vote. So here is a dilemma where, who am I to tell my mother to restrict her right to vote? But I am doing this. So there is this personal level that is extremely important at this moment. But Hungary was mentioned, but let's talk about Brazil, where the president of Brazil outright is supporting protesters who are calling for shutting down democratic institutions and returning to military dictatorship. Or in Philippines, where president gave orders and allowed to shoot dead members of opposition or protesters. We can have many more examples about the surveillance techniques, about technologies that are being used in numbers of countries, China, Armenia, India, Israel, Kenya, Russia. And of course, it's justified when it's going to really help to restrict pandemic, but it's not justified, which is resulting in violations of basic rights to privacy. That is not. Freedom of speech, censorship, social media, monitoring phone communications, forbidding criticism of any kind, workers losing jobs because they criticize governments, because they criticize their employers, and so forth. Right to assembly was already mentioned. But let me move to something that is also very important in my work and in my life, and working on numbers of fronts to protect women's rights. In Bishkek, in Kyrgyzstan, the court issued a decision days after protests by the political opposition, but days before women, including members of LGBTQ community, were planning to march on International Women's Day. And the court cited coronavirus as a justification for the ban, even though there was no confirmed cases at all at that particular time. So maybe it's right that the demonstration did not take place, but what does it really mean for voicing the need to pay attention to the exclusionary practices of that particular government against communities that has never been included and that never been recognized? In the United States, as we know, the women's rights also have been restricted in Ohio, Mississippi, Texas, the states that announced that abortions are not non-essential, so, as other surgeries or procedures that were suspended. Again, in Poland, just 10 days ago, the parliament debated a draft law that will impose near total ban on abortion, criminalize sex education in schools, and equate homosexuality with pedophilia. In the end, the bill was sent to the subcommittee for further consideration. But that proposals were in the parliament sitting from 2017, and they were waiting specifically for a moment where maybe there will be an opening to push this kind of legislation. The Poles like to demonstrate, they know how to do it, and Poles did go on the streets and demonstrate at the front of the parliament by practicing social distancing. So there was one person per car, there were thousands of cars, and others were riding on the bicycles. So there's always a way if there is a will, and then there is a commitment, and then there is a social consciousness. But I think what was very troublesome is what the parliamentary speaker, Elżbieta Witek, argued, why that legislation has been actually put at the front of the parliament. And she argued that it's a parliament obligation to fulfill its democratic mandate and discuss the proposed legislation on the floor because these initiatives were undertaken by citizens. So here we see this juxtaposition of using the human rights framework in a pursuit of very different goals, which were actually against the human rights, the reproductive rights of women. And she argued that, of course, it's very controversial, but in democratic states, as Poland is, citizen projects must be really discussed and must be introduced to the parliament. So I don't want to go into the more detailed examples of how the states are reacting, but let me focus in the last couple minutes on the actually local level. Because local level had to, by virtue of being the closest to citizen, address variety of social and economic conditions. So there was a bit less on focusing on the large scale, but far more about providing citizens with food, with healthcare, with support for the elderly citizens, with taking care of the migrants, again, in a variety of Central and East European countries. There's a lot of mobility because the former Soviet Union countries are having quite a difficult economic situation. So there's a lot of Ukrainians in Poland and Belarusians in other countries and so forth. So local government had to really focus on providing the necessity and in many ways addressing the social inequalities that manifest themselves on the local level. We talk about massive unemployment, but we didn't talk much yet about the domestic violence and child abuse that is happening because citizens were locked in with their abusers. And there are numbers of other racial and socioeconomic disparities that has further exacerbated by pandemic, and Professor Banoun has mentioned. So ultimately, the emergency power did unlock, because of the pandemic, did provide executive branch with vast abilities to act. But there is an implicit assumption there that these states will use these powers in a reasonable way, and they will be not infringing on the universal human rights. So the question is this assumption really indeed correct? And can we believe that implicit assumption without certain legal frameworks will allow us to preserve the democratic institution and preserve human rights? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. So we have a chance now to follow up somewhat with both Professor Regulska and Professor Banoun. We've prepared some follow-up questions for them that I'll now pose, but these questions are built around the idea that there will be a time when the pandemic has subsided, that society will be in a position to begin to reconstruct or construct or build anew, and that's a critical question about how that could take place. And, historically, international responses to a global crisis of this nature have sometimes led to societies becoming more equal, with less economic inequality, and more committed to addressing economic, social, and cultural rights, most especially health, education, environment, and science. In fact, the modern human rights idea itself is a response to the Second World War. And it brings me to thinking about the contrast between some of what Professor Regulska and I were arguing, and the really critically important point that Professor Banoun is making, which is, we have to beat the virus first. But sometimes this has often been a discussion when wars have been fought or movements have been mounted, which is you fight the war, you win the war first, and then you can talk about what happens after that takes place. And I'm wondering if this is an opportunity for us in our current situation to be able to do both, to have a conversation about what kind of society we want to see on the other end of this process. So among the greatest challenges of this moment is not just how we exercise our rights, but also how we take collective responsibility for defending the rights of those who have taken on that burden. To do so will require a recommitment, I would say, to economic, cultural, and social rights in a broad and systematic way that embraces the international. It's a vision or a renewal of a vision of human rights that has often been forgotten in times and places where individualism and the idealization of the market have reigned supreme. The economy instead of humanity, I suppose. So let me now turn back to Karima. So we've talked a lot about how critical the arts and cultural rights are, the right to have culture, have been in the lives of people during emergencies like this one, wars and revolutions, displacement events, for refugees and other people facing diaspora. And I was going to ask you about what are some of the risks about that would be associated with forgetting dimensions of culture. But I'd like you to try to answer that. But I also want you to help us think through this other idea that you proposed during your initial presentation, which was how do we begin the process of commemoration to bring together the memory of those who are lost, what has been lost, to make sure that it is not forgotten, that it's properly mourned, it becomes part of our inheritance, our human inheritance of this moment, and really what role universities and the humanities can play in that. Karima?
Oh.
I'm so sorry, I'm back. I lost, the internet just cut out, so I missed the end of the question.
The very end of the question was, in your initial presentation, you talked about this idea of memorialization, commemoration, memory, and you made a very poignant point about the kinds of artists and art that we are losing in this moment. It reminds me on a much smaller scale of what happened when Hurricane Katrina destroyed much of New Orleans and the great loss of important jazz musicians and others. And how do we make certain that doesn't happen again in this moment? How do we assure ourselves our right to culture in this moment, and to the right to remember what has happened, and not to be told that it didn't happen, which is also, I'm sure, being planned by some. And what would be the role of a university in doing that, especially in the humanities and social sciences?
So I think I'll focus on the first part of your question and leave the question regarding universities for the Vice Chancellor. I work on cultural rights, which include the right to take part in cultural life, the right to artistic and to scientific freedom, and the right to benefit from science, things that are sometimes seen as luxury items. But I think in the face of this pandemic, we clearly have to recognize as absolutely central to our ability to cope and to get through this pandemic. I've been trying to spread the word really that culture is the heart of our response to COVID-19. Science may be the head, but the culture is really the heart. And as you said, Professor Watt-Paul, we're mourning so many losses in the cultural field in every region of the world, from the Chinese film director Shang Kai, who died along with 5 members of his family, to the Cameroonian jazz musician Manu Dibango, and beyond. And I think we have to remember them all, as you said, and we have to draw strength from the work that they have bequeathed us. And I would really argue we have to honor their memories by supporting artists and continuing to promote a nourishing cultural life for everyone. And I was really impressed by an article written recently by a Black Canadian artist, Amanda Paris, who was asking what kind of new world we want to build. And her answer really, which I second, was that it lies in reflecting on what we don't want to continue. And she said, in this new iteration, we have to stop devaluing artists' worth. And I think that that's absolutely true. So for me, when I look at this from my perspective, building this new world, constructing a new world, not reconstructing the old one, really requires a human rights and a cultural rights perspective. And these rights, again, are guaranteed by international law, and they continue to apply today. Now, I've already mentioned that limitations are also acceptable on these rights, and I am deeply disturbed that culture is sometimes being used as a justification for violating legitimate public health measures. I was very saddened to see the large funeral in New York City a couple of days ago, bringing together thousands of people in person, using a religious justification. That's just one example. I'm not singling out that group. There have been many other examples, and it is really essential that culture is practiced in ways that protect the right to health and the right to life, because culture should be about enhancing and promoting human survival, not about spreading disease. So that is very important. We need to think about how we have cultural life now on the internet, but also in the face of the digital divide. We need to remember that human rights continue to apply on the internet. We need to think about how we can envisage when the pandemic is over, when we have a vaccine, a renaissance of public cultural life, because it is so important that we have alternative cultural modes now, but that's a complement, not an alternative. And we do want to get back eventually, when it's safe, to that public cultural life. And we really have to commit to that. In the meantime, we need a global cultural plan to keep alive the culture that is helping keep us alive. And Stephen King said a wonderful thing. He tweeted something wonderful, which is, people say that, artists are useless and meaningless. And he said, well, then try getting through quarantine without books, art, music, films, and so on. And all people are doing this, whether, at all levels of society, whether they're listening to the radio or they're watching films, or they're out on their balconies safely with social distancing, singing with their neighbors, and so on. So we need a global cultural plan, and it needs funding. We need a minimum of the 1% of the funding that is going to go to reconstruction to go to the cultural sector, or this, simply is not going to happen. And the cultural resources that we need to get through this period are not going to be able to survive. Artists, cultural practitioners, like so many others, are, out of work, unable to practice in public, and so on. So lots more to say there, but I really do want to get to the Q&A so everybody has a chance to be heard. I want to end this. I think it comes out of working on cultural rights with a sense of, again, optimism, which is not false hope. Optimism is about looking reality squarely in the face and building a new determination to contend with that reality. And I always remember what an Afghan woman said to me 10 years ago when I was interviewing her for my book. She said, optimism is key to survival. And I think if we use human rights as a tool to empower us, if we draw on our cultural resources, if we look reality squarely in the face, but we also look at a better tomorrow, we can say that together we will prevail. And I think that, to me, is the core message, the core takeaway.
So before I turn to Professor Rogulska, what I want to encourage people who are watching us out there in YouTube land to please write up questions and submit them. We have some that are beginning to come in. These will be posed to the three of us to try to answer in the remaining time. So as I said in the introduction, universities are one of the most remarkable engines for good ever imagined by the human mind, right? When we're operating well, we can do just the things that we're capable of doing are extraordinary. And in order for us to sort of regain the international or even maintain the international this time, when travel is shut down, when we're reduced to sort of soul-numbing Zoom conversations across international borders, where one of the most critical elements of what we've been able to accomplish and what has a lasting impact upon generations of young people is student exchange. What are we going to be able to do? What can we do to meet these humanitarian needs of refugees, mounting human rights challenges, as making certain that data and science is shared effectively? How do we mobilize an institution like UC Davis to actually achieve, do what we should be doing in this historical moment?
So I assume this question is to me.
Yes, it definitely is.
So I actually think we are doing a lot, which means that we are prepared to move to the next level. And what we need to do further is, first of all, to intensify our efforts to educate. And I'll come back to it in a minute. We obviously doing research, but we have to begin to think how we are collaborating across the globe with other partners in different parts of the world, because their cultural experiences are actually different and may inform how we coming up with the global solutions about which we were talking a little bit earlier. We need to work with the community surrounding us. The fact that we are already building up the momentum to expand our engaged scholarship programs, the fact that we're working with the policymakers, but we have to do more of the policy work to again inform some strategies that we want to pursue. So educating, doing research, doing more community work, and we have elements of it. We have human rights program, which is excellent. We're working on numbers of ways of how to integrate the global engagement and global learning through the global education for all. We have the engaged scholarship. So we actually have a lot of pieces. But let me bring a few points where it's going to be critical for us to think. We can do all of these things, but we have to have a framework and be cognizant of a few things that will be changing and has already changed. One of them is changing demographics of our students. And in order for us to be successful, we have to be far more cognizant about it, because it's changing and it will dramatically change in the years to come. The pandemic has diversified and will diversify our student body. And a lot of those things might not be apparent right away from the beginning, but there will be an underlying tone. And there are two extreme scenarios is that on one hand, we're going to become far more homogenized because only some will be able to come and afford the education. And on the other hand, that we actually be unprepared to bring diversified student body, which is going to have such a wide ranging of needs that as an institution, we might not actually be able to carry it through. And of course, going back to the Article 26, the right to education, we are in a danger that not only in the United States, but across the world, that right to education is going to be questionable even more than it is right now. And we know about it. So the inclusivity will be actually critical for us to recognize the diversity of our students. And that means that we're going to have to create kind of programming that is create the opportunity to being accessible for all kind of students. So accessibility of the programs is going to be something that we're going to have to really think both here at home, but also abroad. Advising of the students. If we have more diversified student body, we're going to have to do far more and deeper and more sophisticated advising to make sure that these students don't drop out, that they that do not have sufficient support, and that they actually graduate. Issues of racial, ethnic, gender, socioeconomic inclusivity will be extremely important for us to watch, to develop programming, so that programming provides equitable access and engage students in the concrete actions. Because actually, what's going to be critical for students to take actions? We need to educate next generation that has theoretical background, that has philosophical background, that understand the concepts, that they can use these tools. But ultimately, they're going to have to know how to translate that body of knowledge into very specific actions, because that is the generation that is coming to us, will be the generation that will actually going to have to lift us. That's the future generation that are going to be changing the world. And we can't be behind. We have to be ahead and provide that knowledge and that skills. So our Global Education for All is obviously aiming to provide that global learning opportunities, whether on the classroom, on the campus, abroad, and through many, many different ways. But the goal here is to provide diverse perspective across the wide range spectrum of differences, that these are acknowledged, that our students understand our own identities and how this identity actually not impact them, but impact others. So some of the rhetoric of how, we have China virus, we have a virus from Wuhan, these are not right ways of accepting cultural diversity. The second thing is that the deepening global inequalities and divides. And we need to recognize that the world is going to be very different, that some of our partners going to not have socioeconomic means or political openness to actually partner with us. So how do we engage our students with this equitable notion and providing wide spectrum of opportunities where we're going to not be able to work with some people in some countries and some of the world. And finally, global challenges are articulating themselves locally. And I think the pandemic has really brought this for us and taught us. So how do we prepare students to be capable of engaging and addressing these challenges? They don't have to travel. They can engage here locally. And it's our responsibility to create opportunities in such a way that when they can travel, they'll be ready to travel and take the action, because they will understand the key concept and also understand how to engage in action. So some of the work that we're doing around the UN Sustainable Development Goals framework offers actually terrific opportunity to learn, because the 17 goals address all these different rights that we have been talking about today. So I will stop it here, and we still have some time for the questions.
I actually don't think that the SDGs will survive the pandemic. It'll be a reconstructive goals. I mean, we're no longer in sustainability, right? It's going to be a much different. The UN will mobilize, hopefully, around a much different agenda. So we have a series of really neat questions about the use of data and statistics. Again, questions about the role of the university. But the one I wanted to pose to Karima, because she's the only international lawyer I know well, is this emerging, it's almost a facetious idea, but I think it's going to have some traction, is the creation of immunity passports. In other words, these would be passports or chips in skin or blockchain documents on cell phones that you could hold up and show to an employer or at the entrance of a basketball game, saying that you are not going to get coronavirus because you're already immune. And I'm wondering if you could speculate on the human rights elements of a proposed immunity passport idea.
I'm really sorry. Again, I'm having internet trouble, and I didn't hear most of that. So I don't know if you want to just pose a question to Joanna while her internet is more stable, or
can you hear me? Immunity
now
passports. Immunity passports, good or bad?
I mean, I think I think that's a very complicated question. I think that there could be some important public health utility, but the key factor is trust of the government, trust between the government and the population, which can be gravely undermined if that data is going to be misused. And in many situations, I think there's a realistic possibility of that. And I know my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy, has been raising those concerns. Nevertheless, I think, if we did have a human rights respecting way of doing something perhaps like that, It could be related to tracing and contact tracing and all that we need to be doing. But I think if governments violate that fundamental trust with their populations, it could be very risky, and it goes back to that sort of calculus, the framework of the Human Rights Committee about necessity, proportionality, and respecting international standards in the way that you use it.
Right. I'm going to pose. Joanna, did you have something to add on?
No, it could be useful, but we also know how data collection has been tremendously misused against citizens by the state government. So this is where the danger is.
Right, and so that's the question I was about to pose to you, which is, someone writes, statistics are vital to epidemiology and to human rights, but are often very dehumanizing and can have other consequences, including labeling who should have access and who doesn't get access. But how could human rights defenders use data effectively in this context without losing the power and necessity of personal narrative? And I would just sort of add, what are some of the most critical privacy concerns that are at risk as we try to move forward, especially when testing of large numbers of people is going to be one of the measures moving forward. How that data is used and who controls it and so on.
Well, I'm not the epidemiologist, so I'm going to not venture into the unsafe territory. But from what I understand, the danger also is that you can have all these false positive results, and that could create a complete hayfork on which data is correct, which data is not correct. And so there is a danger that we began to label, but this label actually will be wrong from the beginning. And then we began to classify groups of people. And then we began to build up a larger schemes of data manipulation. So, yes, we need some data, we need science, we need research, but we, at the same time, repeatedly ending up with the data breach. How often do we hear, oh yes, Facebook this, oh, credit cards this, or the privacy of data was infringed, and so forth. So there is nothing that I believe that I can trust that collecting large number of data will actually not be used against the citizens. So I think the part of the issue is, how can we create protection of privacy? Because the data is being collected all the time already through these drones, through the phone communications, which I mentioned earlier. Many countries right now, many states are already collecting vast majority of surveying vast majority of its citizens. So can we protect the data? Probably not. Will the data will be misused? Yes. Should we correct the data in order to advance science? Yes. And I think this is where we are in the paradox of tensions. How can we use the data for the common good to advance because we need it? And yet, how the data going to be against citizens in the different countries? And it's not that few countries. Every country uses the data against its citizen one way or the other. So there is no perfect setup at this moment.
Right. I think on that note, we'll start to wind down the conversation. I want to thank the DHI for inviting us, the Human Rights Studies program, on behalf of Global Affairs and the School of Law, for inviting us to take part in this series. I know that they are planning to do additional ones, and also the Human Rights Studies is planning to invite its colleagues to also make additional additional opportunities for conversation online to take place around other human rights issues, including immigration and refugees, universal access to health care, and indigenous rights. And we're hoping these will be able to continue online through the end of the quarter, and then as rules and regulations about social distancing and gathering begin to change, we'll examine being able to do these in a more traditional format. So a link to tonight's recording will be up on the DHI website at dhi.ucdavis.edu. And the good people at the DHI have also asked me to mention that it has 2 upcoming events in May. The first is a book chat on May 12th with Greg Downs on the American Civil War in relation to other 19th century revolutionary movements, and a PhD Unlimited event on curating your digital identity. So for more information and to sign up for these, I encourage you to head to the DHI newsletter. So my closing thought is, in the words of Antonio Guterres, we're in this together, and that our shared humanity is what is going to be able to get us through to this moment. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.